When we think of Israel being a superpower, our minds automatically think of Israel underneath King David and his son Solomon. However, there was another dynasty that could have brought Israel to an ancient superpower status, and you most likely have heard about them. In the Hebrew Bible, more specifically the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, two of the main villains of the long narrative covering both books were the evil king Ahab of northern Israel and his idolatrous wife Jezebel, where the two often battled with the prophet Elijah and God over idolatry and Baal worship in northern Israel. However, because of his villainous status in the narrative, a common misconception has formed that King Ahab and his dynasty, the Omrides, was harmful to Israel as a whole. However, this simply was not the case. In fact, it was quite opposite. Today we'll be discussing how the Omri dynasty nearly became an ancient superpower. Before the rise of the Omrides, the kingdom of northern Israel was in a tough spot. According to the biblical account, the northern kingdom had just gained its independence from Judah after being subjugated underneath the Davidic dynasty for years. And while northern Israel was independent, it was facing heavy political instability, and the political structure of northern Israel was in shambles until, of course, the Omrides came along. However, how exactly the Omride dynasty was formed in northern Israel in general is debatable. The archaeologist Israel Finkelstein proposed the idea that based on the contemporary evidence, both Judah and northern Israel were both separate nations and were never united, except for a brief period under King Saul where a semi-united monarchy occurred. And according to his theory, this was short-lived, as Sheshach I of Egypt destroys Saul's kingdom and split up northern Israel and Judah once more. However, other scholars such as William Dever dispute this claim, arguing there is archaeological evidence for the biblical account series of events. I'm actually in the process of researching for a video on the topic of the United Monarchy, so stay tuned for that. Regardless of whether the biblical series of events is accurate or not, northern Israel was in its formative years for sure. However, under the Omrides, that quickly changed. Soon after Omri, the founder of the Omri dynasty, rose to power, he immediately began initiatives to strengthen northern Israel's geopolitical stance, primarily doing this by establishing economic alliances with the Phoenicians and starting massive construction projects within Israel to secure northern Israelite interests, most notably in the areas of the Galilee and Gilead, where he established many forts and military outposts to defend against the Eerdmans, which were located in Syria. For most of their history, both Judah and northern Israel were vassals, with the two states alternating underneath the vassalage of either Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, or Aramea. However, under the Omrides that changed, because soon after its establishment, the Omride dynasty asserted its independence from Aramea. Although we do not know exactly when this occurred, the book of 1st Kings could provide an answer. And while yes, the biblical account is somewhat biased and does have a theological agenda, that aspect isn't unique in ancient Near Eastern sources. And if examined carefully, it can provide a good historical reconstruction, which I think the passage we will be looking at today can. The account of 1 Kings 20 described a situation the northern Israelites faced under Ahab, where King ben-hadad II of Aram Damascus and a coalition of tribal chieftains from the surrounding area surrounded the Omride capital, Samaria, and demanded Ahab to submit to vassalage. There are debates on whether or not this event actually happened during Ahab's reign or the reign of a Nimshide king, although the chronology of these events certainly lines up, placing the battle in Ahab's early reign. Now, the reason for this invasion could have possibly been because of either prior vassalage or because ben-hadad and his coalition saw the rising threat to their power that was Omride Israel. In the ensuing battle described in the passage, the northern Israelites were able to defeat the Eerdmans, and the Israelites were able to capture ben-hadad. Of course, this resulted in nothing major, because Ahab was merciful and allowed ben-hadad to go, although Ahab was able to forge an alliance with Aramea in the process. This alliance lasted up until the Battle of Kekar, which was a battle where an Aramean and Israelite-led coalition battled against Assyria, resulting in a coalition defeat. After the Battle of Kekar, relations soured between the two, and northern Israel, along with Judah, launched an invasion of Aram Damascus, which resulted in King Ahab's death. And the snowball effect occurred where northern Israel was crippled by the invasion of the son of ben-hadad, Hazael, which ultimately resulted in a rival house within the Omri dynasty, the Nimshides, led by the military general Jehu, overthrowing and ultimately destroying the Ahabite Omri dynasty. Under Jehu, northern Israel would become a vassal to Aram Damascus and was diplomatically isolated up until Jeroboam II's golden age. However, by then Israel's chance at empire was doomed, and northern Israel would soon be conquered by Assyria in the 8th century. But what if that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the Omrides were able to neutralize the threat of Aram Damascus and establish an imperial domain over all of the Levant? This video will be going over how the Omrides could establish this empire, the effects this empire would have within the Levant itself, and the effects this empire would have on the ancient Near East in general. In the battle described in 1 Kings 20, had Ahab been less merciful to ben-hadad and executed him as the passage suggests he should have done, the effects would greatly benefit Israel. Immediately following the defeat and execution of ben-hadad, the Damascene government would be consumed by a secessionist crisis. This would occur because the battle described in 1 Kings 20 occurred sometime before the Battle of Kekar, giving the date of the battle to be sometime in between 865 BC and 853 BC, meaning possibly ben-hadad's son Hazael would have been too young to lead or would not have been born yet. Regardless, Aram would be fractured, and considering how northern Israel certainly had a manpower, they would be able to sweep through Aram and capture Damascus, and with the conquest of Aramea, northern Israel's political standing would be secure. For now, at least. The geopolitical situation during the 9th century in the ancient Near East is difficult to describe. During this time, the Assyrian Empire had just re-established its traditional borders from the Bronze Age and was highly militarily active. However, soon after the re-establishment of its traditional borders, Assyria began to face internal conflicts due to the provincial system of Assyria and dynastic disputes causing ever more internal instability while provincial leaders acted with more autonomy. This situation was exacerbated by external factors as well, with nations such as the Babylonians and Elamites actively threatening Assyrian dominance. This situation got so bad that by the time of the 8th century, Assyria could no longer campaign outside their borders, and often provincial officials themselves had to wage campaigns to protect their provinces. Honestly, I'm very surprised the Assyrian Empire did not fall during this time period, because had a large military threat appeared, the Assyrian Empire would have been done for. Thankfully for the Assyrians though, this did not happen in our timeline, and the Assyrian kings of Tiglath-Pileser III and Sargon III were able to reform Assyria and turn it into the empire we know it for today. However, had a stronger Omride Israel existed, this most likely would not occur. Over the course of its development, the Omride state would most likely expand primarily through diplomatic relations, marriages, and of course, conquests. Assyria would most likely see Omride Israel as a threat and attempt to neutralize it, most likely resulting in an alternate Battle of Kekar, and considering Omride Israel's expanding influence at the time, they most likely would be able to rally a coalition around themselves similar to our timeline. Although I do not think this would result in another outcome. I think the Assyrians will still be victorious, but also I do not believe this would be a defeat that would doom the Omride state. Most likely what would occur is that Assyria would demand tribute in the form of goods and natural resources from the Levant, as during this time the Assyrian elite was practically addicted to the goods and natural resources coming from the Levant, such as wood, copper, gold, wine, olive oil, and luxury goods. This was because Mesopotamia itself was devoid of natural resources and often needed imported goods to support its population and infrastructure. So how exactly does northern Israel fit into this? Most likely northern Israel would comply as a tributary state as first, but slowly making its moves towards independence and ultimate domination of Assyria. So I'll be discussing how exactly they would be able to do this, but keep in mind this is pure speculation based on the actions of the Omri dynasty during the short time period it existed. So again, pure speculation. So it is a given to reinforce their position, the Omrides would make geopolitical moves to the north and moves to the south. However, the Omrides' primary focus would be the north. With Assyria's power breaking in the region, the Phoenicians would be economically hurt by this, considering how demand for Phoenician products decreased during breaks in Assyrian power, and the Assyrians often protected the Phoenician city-states from raiders, although the Assyrians extorted Phoenicia in the process. Phoenicians were in an exposed position during this time and only rebelled under Assyria when heavy tribute was placed on them, meaning they would most likely cooperate with the Omrides for economic reasons, mainly to have a secure trade partner and to secure trade routes. This can be attested in our timeline where the Phoenician city-state of Tyre set up an alliance with the Omrides, and most likely this relationship would continue. I can see Phoenicia being a close ally of Omride Israel, if not in a personal union with Israel. This would mitigate the influence and impacts of the Phoenician colonies in the Mediterranean. Many of these colonies existed only after the Assyrian presence was diminished and trade routes were disrupted, and with the Omrides filling that void left by Assyria, there wouldn't be as great as a need to spread out west, although I still do think Phoenician colonies would still exist. I just do not think these colonies would be as massive as they were in our timeline. Along with an alliance with Phoenicia, I also think the Omrides would conquer many of the Aramaic and Neo-Hittite kingdoms in Syria. I mainly think this because the Omrides would want to secure trade routes throughout the Levant, including these states in the process, although I can see these states as allies to Israel, considering often these Aramaic and Neo-Hittites were major trade partners of the Phoenicians, although I do think these Syriac kingdoms would fall under economic domination by the Omrides. However, I do not think there will be any nativist uprisings, considering in our timeline the Omrides often pandered to the Eerdmans, and I can see bilingualism between Hebrew and Aramaic be used in Omride documents. And most likely, given how Aramaic was more populated than Palestine, a language with a blend of Aramaic and Hebrew would be adopted, if not the complete adoption of Aramaic as the official language. In the south, the Omrides would also be pursuing an alliance with Judah, which I think would be successful considering it was successful in our timeline. The Omrides in the native Divide dynasty would begin intermarrying as they did in our timeline. However, without the Nimshad rebellion occurring, this would result in continued integration between the two dynasties. Eventually, a personal union would form between northern Israel and Judah, which would eventually lead to complete integration. As for the other Hebraic tribes in the south, a majority of Moabite territory was already under the control of the Omrides in our timeline, and Edom was under the control of Judah as well. So those two tribes would be pretty much automatically part of the Omride Empire at that point. Another Hebraic tribe that would be of interest to the Omrides would be Ammon. According to the Kirk monoliths, Ammon during this time was independent. However, at this point, it would be very hard for Ammon not to be incorporated into the expanding Omride political system. Another political entity in the south of interest to the Omrides would be the Philistine city-states. These city-states already paid tribute to Judah prior, so I doubt much would change underneath the Omrides. The Omrides would also have an interest through a trade perspective, considering joint trade expeditions were pursued by the Solomonic Kingdom and the Phoenicians in the Red Sea to the land of Ophir, which is most commonly interpreted as southern Arabia, Sudan, or India. However, it most likely is referring to an island in the Mediterranean such as Sardinia. These expeditions could possibly be pursued again under the Omrides, and if these expeditions are successful, it could make Edom and Judah extremely rich, with the port of Ezion-Geber becoming a prime trading hub. Although I think these trading ambitions won't be fully realized until Israel's complete independence. With the Omride dynasty rapidly expanding, Assyria's days would be numbered. By the time of the 8th century, the Assyrian Empire would be rapidly deteriorating. Assyria at this point would be highly dependent on the Omrides, and similar to how in our timeline the Roman Severan dynasty was politically dependent on the will of the army, Assyria would be politically dependent on the will of the Omrides. Most likely by the early 8th century, some sort of political disputes such as the issue of trade, tribute, or some other issue would be used as justification to invade Assyria. This most likely would result in the Chaldeans in Babylonia and the Elamites rebelling in what would be the final nail in the coffin for Assyria. The war would result in the Assyrian hegemony being divided among the Omrides, Babylonians, and Elamites, and by the mid-8th century, the Omride Empire would be the dominant force in the Levant. By the mid-8th century, a massive earthquake hit the Levant. Had the Omrides not been able to conquer Assyria by this date, the Omrides would most likely be too weak to combat the Assyrians, and most likely would be conquered by them. This obviously would make the scenario pointless, so in order for the scenario to work, it is necessary for the Omrides to defeat Assyria before 760 BC. While the earthquake will still occur regardless of whether or not Assyria is defeated, the effects of it would be drastically different. Had the Omrides been able to defeat Assyria before the earthquake, the Omrides would not only recover from the earthquake, but also consolidate their political power. This would be because the Omride dynasty would lack geopolitical rivals, which would give them time to recover, and the earthquake would also give the Omrides justification to further centralize their political power. They would use this earthquake as an opportunity, and most likely would use the opportunity to rebuild their hegemony in an Israelite fashion. This actually happened in our timeline to some extent, with the port city of Dor being refashioned in an Israelite way during the time of the Omrides. This would be further exaggerated with the entire Levant in ruins, and the Omrides would be able to support this rebuilding process primarily through trade in the Mediterranean and possibly even the Red Sea. This earthquake would also give the Omride justification to further centralize their state. This justification would come through religious justification. You see, the primary court cult of the Omride dynasty was the worship of the Ugaritic god Baal, although there is a debate on whether or not this Baal was a Phoenician or Israelite variant of Baal. The earthquake would be most likely used as justification to force the cult of Baal onto the populace, or at least the non-Israelite populace, that is. The Israelites were already worshipping Baal at that point. And the dynasty would most likely claim Baal was angry with the Omrides and struck Israel with the earthquake. This would change the Israelite religion forever, as Yahwism would most likely be suppressed in Judah. It would never form what is now known as Judaism, and the Israelite religion would remain polytheistic. This would have great effects throughout the Levant, as an Aramaic Hebraic culture, language, and religion would begin spreading throughout the Levant, and the Omrides would most likely centralize further, centralizing their diplomatic empire, forming a covenant state of Yadal-Habal, which is Hebrew for children of Baal. Although personally I don't think they would call themselves this, I just thought it was a fun name and went with it. The Omride covenant state of Yadal-Habal would most likely exit their recovery stage by the mid-7th century. During this time, a geopolitical rivalry would occur between the Omride Empire and the rising Chaldean Empire, and competing to outdo the Babylonians, the Omrides would expand into Egypt, establishing a puppet dynasty. The Omrides would be able to conquer Egypt by exploiting Egypt's political instability and cutting it off from the warhorse trade, since Egypt was highly dependent on northern Israel's warhorses. The Babylonians would most likely make similar moves by expanding into Iran or Anatolia to counter the invasion of Egypt. And while this might be considered an Omride golden age in trade and prosperity, by the 6th or 5th century, the empire would begin deteriorating on the inside. Corruption would run rampant, and the populations of the Levant would be increasingly oppressed by the central government in Samaria. This would result in highly resistant populations, as well as nationalism would spread throughout the Levant. The most notable example of this rise in nationalism would be in Judah, where a new Yahwistic movement would form and small guerrilla rebellions would occur. This instability would result in the empire eventually being conquered either by the Babylonians or maybe even an empire with its origins in Iran. Regardless of how the destruction of the Omride Empire occurs, the Levant and the ancient world in general would be drastically changed because of the Omrides' influence. The Levant's culture will be radically different than our timeline, as a semi-homogeneous culture not seen since the Bronze Age collapse would arise in the Levant, as well as Israelite religion and other cultural values would spread out and influence not only the other cultures of the Levant, but the ancient Near East as a whole. Judaism also wouldn't exist as well, and as a result, the other Abrahamic faiths of Christianity and Islam would never rise. This would cause a whole nother set of axial age religions to emerge from the ashes of the Omride Empire. But that is a story for another time, and a topic to cover in another video. First off, I would like to thank the viewer for watching, as you watching this video helps grow the channel. I really like doing this type of content, and I'm hoping to do a lot more in the future as I try to orientate my channel in this direction towards more biblical studies type content. I'm currently working on a script for a video on the topic of David's United Monarchy, and I plan to make it in 2 parts. Part 1 summarizing the United Monarchy in Jewish and Christian tradition, and the second part covering the debate on its historicity. But that might take a while, as a lot of research will be needed to cover the debate properly. Anyways, with that said, I better get to work. Chicken out.